So now let's examine this important aspect of classroom management, managing student behavior. We need to understand and realize that effective teaching and learning cannot and will not take place in a poorly managed classroom. But with so many different approaches to classroom management, it's important for us to clearly define what we mean by classroom management. Classroom management refers to the actions that we as teachers take to create a supportive environment for both academic and social-emotional learning of our students. And this could include developing caring, supportive relationships with and among our students, organizing and implementing instruction in ways that optimize our students' access to learning, encouraging our students' engagement in academic tasks, promoting the development of student social skills and self-regulation, and of course, using appropriate interventions to assist students with behavior problems. Another helpful definition of classroom management refers to the actions we take as teachers to create and maintain a learning environment conducive to successful instruction, including how we arrange the physical classroom environment, our establishment of rules and procedures, and of course, maintaining students' attention to lessons and engagement in activities. Regardless of which definition of classroom management we adopt, we should note that nearly all definitions emphasize the importance of actions taken by the teacher to facilitate learning among the students. That's why classroom management is really about creating an inviting and appealing learning environment for our students. Though there are an infinite number of approaches to classroom management, we can usually categorize them in terms of two categories: proactive and reactive. Proactive classroom management is all about the behind-the-scenes or invisible moves and maneuvering employed by teachers to stop misbehavior before it starts. For example, establishing rules and procedures and favorable teacher-student relationships. Reactive classroom management is more about disciplinary interventions, which are certainly necessary because we cannot plan for every potential off-task or disruptive occurrence. That's why both of these elements are necessary. So at a glance, here are some examples of proactive and reactive classroom management approaches. Some proactive measures that teachers must take include establishing rules and procedures, building favorable teacher-student relationships, managing of content, such as the classroom space, the materials, equipment needed by students, the ability of students and teachers to move safely around the room, as well as design and delivery of content. There's also management of covenant. In other words, a safe environment that includes social dynamics and interpersonal relationships. On the reactive side, we see things such as disciplinary interventions, giving reminders and warnings to our students, as well as implementing clearly communicated consequences in respectful and appropriate ways. It can also be the way that we manage disciplinary problems and potentially volatile situations with students. But as teachers, we need to understand that we will encounter a significant amount of off-task and/or disruptive behavior. There are just so many things for our students to think about and worry about, in addition to the learning activities that we've prepared. But there are ways to reduce a significant amount of off-task or disruptive behavior. We can be proactive by ensuring that students understand and can perform expected behaviors. And when in doubt, we can always go back and teach as well as reteach expected behaviors. We can plan to give the same consequence every time the misbehavior occurs and with every student to ensure consistency. We can also make efforts to increase our positive ratios of interactions with a student who's struggling. This means paying particular attention to when the student is exhibiting positive behavior. When off-task or disruptive behavior occurs, we can employ effective reactive classroom management approaches, such as implementing corrective consequences consistently, making sure that the corrective consequences we implement fit the severity and frequency of the misbehavior. We can also design consequences that are mild enough that we feel comfortable assigning them every time. And perhaps most importantly, implementing consequences unemotionally by keeping our interactions brief, avoiding arguments, or feeling the need to over-explain or over-justify the decision we've made. Now, when we look at the Danielson Framework for Teaching, 3 elements of classroom management are emphasized: communicating clear expectations to our students, monitoring student behavior, and responding to student behavior in a way that's appropriate and respectful. These first 2 elements of classroom management identified in the Danielson Framework, expectations and monitoring of student behavior, are proactive. whereas our efforts to respond to student misbehavior effectively is more reactive. So let's take a closer look at each of these elements of the Danielson framework. First, expectations. It needs to be clear either from what the teacher says or by inference from students that expectations for conduct have been established and that they're being implemented. So, as a practicum student, teacher, or as a newer teacher, I need to become familiar with the school's code of conduct. I need to utilize clearly stated classroom expectations that are iterative of the school's rules and expectations that can serve as guidelines to help my students in decision making, as well as serve as gentle reminders. I might start off the school year with a reminder of the school rules. You know, students, in our class and school, we always strive to be positive and uplifting to others. Communicating these clear expectations early on lay the foundation for helping students engage in good decision making and allow us to remind them of these rules should problems occur. The Danielson framework also addresses the need for us to monitor student behavior. We need to remember that experienced teachers seem to have eyes in the backs of their head. They're attuned to what's happening in the classroom and can move subtly to help students when necessary to re-engage with the content being addressed in the lesson. All of this is subtle, preventative, but absolutely necessary. Monitoring of student behavior can be tricky if we're anchored to the front of the room. That's why it's important to move and monitor in a way that allows you to remain in tune with what's going on around you, using proxemics, eye contact, and other body language to redirect students. Also addressed in the Danielson framework is how we respond to student misbehavior. We know that even experienced teachers find that their students occasionally violate one or another of the agreed upon standards of conduct, and that how we respond to these infractions is an important mark of our skill. So we need to try and understand why students are conducting themselves in such a manner. Are they unsure of the content? Are they trying to impress their friends? And respond in a way that respects the dignity of our students. It could be said that the best responses are those that address misbehavior early on in an episode. For example, we might notice students in one part of the classroom that are being off task and or disruptive. Oftentimes, we simply need to move closer to students, remind them of the expectations, use we language, and refer back to the school or class rules. This allows us to remain objective and provide students with a gentle reminder of expectations that have already been established. Then we simply continue with instruction, often staying just a bit closer to the students who needed a little bit of a reminder of the rules and expectations. Now, if the off-task or disruptive behavior persists, we could just try moving closer to students again, reminding them of the same expectations, but this time remind students of what a previously established or logical consequence will be if the behavior persists. Then we return to instruction, staying close to the students that we visited with. But let's say even those reminders don't work. If the undesirable behavior persists, we simply and calmly implement the consequences that have been established. There's no need to argue with students or become emotional. We could say something like, earlier we talked about the need for each of us to be on task when there's work to be done. So just like we talked about, let's pick up our stuff and let's move to a place where we can better focus. Then we simply resume instruction. Now, when we talk about effective classroom management and what that really consists of, what we're talking about are these four components: the physical layout of the classroom, demonstrating with-itness or our awareness of what's going on in the classroom, how we acknowledge adherence to rules and procedures. In other words, what do we do when students are doing what's been asked and expected of them, as well as acknowledging a lack of adherence to rules and procedures, recognizing and addressing when students are off task and or disruptive or not in harmony with the procedures that we've set up. So there are four questions that I need to ask myself as a classroom teacher. What will I do to make the physical layout of the classroom most conducive to learning? What will I do to demonstrate with-itness in my classroom? What will I do to acknowledge adherence to rules and procedures? And what will I do to acknowledge a lack of adherence to rules and procedures? The first element is this: the physical layout of the classroom. The reality is that the environment that we're learning in does impact our ability to learn. So it's very important for us to pay close attention to how we design the classroom, as well as what sort of decoration we include in the design of our classroom. So these are two classrooms that are side by side in a hallway in a school not too far from here. You can tell the rooms have the same dimensions. Okay, same window space. Okay, exactly the same design. But this teacher, when he walked into his classroom, said, this works. Left it as is, made some things work for him, but did not design it with the students in mind. This teacher, on the other hand, walked in and asked, how can I make this learning space a better learning space for my students? How can I design it in a way that I can help support my students in their learning? As well as how can I decorate it in a way that conveys a business-like yet fun and enjoyable atmosphere? And most of the time we have teachers that fall into one of two categories, caring very little or not at all about the design of the classroom, or caring very deeply and paying attention to what are my learning goals for today and how can I design this learning space to help my students be successful. So regardless of the classroom we find ourselves in, regardless of what equipment we have or don't, regardless of our classroom budget, we can and must all ask ourselves these 5 questions. How can I make it so students can move more easily about in the classroom? Okay. We need to be able to set up where students are able to move from place to place, center to center, activity to activity in a way that's safe and doesn't use a lot of time in transitions. We also need to design it in a way where we can move and monitor effectively. Our second consideration, can my students make use of materials and learning centers? Are the spaces themselves designed in a way where all kids can work productively and they have access to everything that they need? Can my students access and use the examples of work that I'm displaying? So if I'm modeling or displaying something, can all kids see and access the materials that I'm making available to them? This includes access and use of information in other parts of the room, maybe past examples, past steps for them to follow. And always, always is my classroom designed in a way that students can easily focus on instruction. In other words, we want to make sure that we arrange and decorate our classrooms in a way that supports effective classroom management. Now, we often wonder what is the best setup, the arrangement of furniture, and other such items to help our students learn effectively. The reality is that based on the learning goal for the day, whatever knowledge, skills that we want our students to develop, different classroom setups might be more appropriate for different learning days or different learning activities. So we need to be open to different designs, flexible classroom spaces that can be altered to best meet the learning goals of our students. The next element of effective classroom management is this: demonstrating with-itness. By with-itness, we mean this: when a teacher is alert and aware of what's occurring in the classroom at all times. So this helps us to identify possible disruptive behaviors and proactively address them. So one strategy for being with it or demonstrated with-itness is just this: being proactive. We need to take steps to become aware of what could potentially go wrong and cause disruption, and then preemptively take action to avoid those scenarios. For example, as a teacher, we might confer privately with potentially disruptive students, review classroom expectations, maybe create a contingency plan for various behavior scenarios before they even happen, and or seek out information regarding incidents that have occurred outside of class that may affect student behavior. In other words, we are thinking about what could potentially go wrong that might be a disruption, and then coming up with an action plan or taking preventative action before it ever occurs. A second strategy would be to make sure that we are occupying the whole room physically and visually. You see, most of us have a tendency to hyper-focus on one part of the classroom, either in where we hang out while we're teaching and monitoring, as well as the attention that we pay to the students. So we need to make sure that we are making eye contact regularly with each student to let them know that he or she is somebody who matters in our classroom, and that we are paying attention to their actions and monitoring what's going on. So we need to make sure that we spend time in each part of the classroom on a regular basis, moving physically during instruction and during individual seat work. So we don't want to get locked into one particular part of the classroom. The further away our students are from us, the more temptation there is to get off task and or disruptive. So you might think of yourself as a shark. Sharks, by the way, have to keep moving in order to survive. If they stop moving, they slowly suffocate. They're creatures that have to keep moving. And so if we think of ourselves as a shark, we want to move around the classroom, not too quick, not too slow, and in a steady but not very predictable pattern to let students know that we are accessible, we're here to help, offer suggestions and feedback, but also that we are with it, that we're aware of what's going on. Send the message that a shark, a loving, kind, caring shark, is in the room and is alert to what's going on. So with itness is a matter of creating that perception that we are aware of everything that's going on. They want to learn, they know that we care, but they also know that we are paying attention and addressing problems that arise. With itness is sometimes incorrectly thought of as something that either a person has or they don't have. And the truth and important reality is that each of us can become with it by developing and engaging in these specific behaviors. Moving, monitoring, and always paying attention visually to what's going on around us. We want to be in a part of the classroom at all times where we can see either directly or through our peripheral vision what all students are engaged in, so that we can pay attention, process, and help our students to learn more effectively. So now we come to this strategy, which is noticing potential problems. We take action and identify preemptively situations that could develop into larger disruptions. We might watch for small groups of students huddled together talking intensely, or a couple of students not engaged in a class activity. We need to take appropriate action to diffuse potentially disruptive behavior before it escalates. So noticing and then addressing that proactively. So think, for example, in the scriptures where we have stories and parables about orchards or about vineyards. There almost always is an individual assigned to the watchtower to keep a lookout for signs of trouble. So if you could think to yourself about the age group that you anticipate working with, what would be some telltale signs that students are starting to get into trouble? Now, if you make a list of those, you're starting to take the first steps of being proactive, identifying on the front end what are some signs of trouble. So if we're talking about students making eye contact across the room, whispering, giggling, unusual noises while the teacher's back is turned, students disengaged because of outside distraction, or students all looking towards one area of the classroom. Maybe a student or multiple students aren't focused during small group work. Figuring out what are the signs that we should be looking for, and then addressing those in a way that's respectful and appropriate to the situation is a way that we demonstrate withedness. Let's take, for example, if students are making eye contact across the room. We could easily place ourselves between the students that are trying to make eye contact with each other. And or we could verbally call on one of those students to show that we're aware that they're disengaged. Hey, what is your thought on this question? That lets them know that we know what is going on, that we're paying attention. And so with each potential problem, we have a list of actions that we've determined beforehand. This is what I could do in this situation that won't disrupt the flow of teaching or of learning, but also let students know that I am with it. Okay. One last suggestion would be this, is to use a series of graduated actions. In other words, when we notice there's a disruptive behavior, we start with something that is quick and not disruptive at all to the learning process. We make eye contact with students involved. If the problem persists, then we might stand right next to an offending student or students and use some nonverbal cues. We use our proxemics, how close we are to the students, move a little closer, and use nonverbal cues. If that persists, still after that, we can talk to a student who's off task and or disruptive quietly and privately. Then if the behavior does not stop, we could stop class and calmly and politely address the disruption. But notice we're using a series of graduated actions, increasingly more intense and focused actions in order to demonstrate withedness. Another key component of effective classroom management is acknowledging adherence to rules and procedures. We don't want to just catch our students when they're not on task or when they're being disruptive. We want to catch them when they are adhering to the rules and procedures that we set up. So for example, we can use verbal affirmation. This is when a teacher uses short verbal affirmations such as thank you, good job, that's great, to acknowledge when students are adhering to the rules. The teacher might also have short conversations with students to acknowledge that kiddos are adhering to rules and procedures. Now, we don't want to leave it just generic as far as good job, that's great. What we really want to do is mention specifically what is the desirable behavior that we notice them doing. For example, thank you for helping your classmate by picking up his or her papers. Or thank you so much for raising your hand before answering. I really appreciate how you're not interrupting other classmates. Do verbal affirmations that are specific to the desirable behavior that you're trying to reinforce. Another form of recognizing students is nonverbal affirmation. This is when we use a smile, a nod of the head, thumbs up, an okay sign, pantomime tip of the hat, something to acknowledge that students are on the right track. So it can be verbal, it can also be nonverbal. Other strategies include tangible recognition, when we use privileges, activities, or items like positive consequences for following rules and procedures. Or token economies. A teacher could develop and use a system where students receive tokens, chits, like we call vouchers, or points when they meet expectations. They can then exchange these tokens or chits or points for privileges, activities, or items. So it might be where they develop so many and then they can cash it in. In this case, the teacher is using a punch card for desirable behaviors or compliance with procedures and actions. And then when the punches are all filled up, the student can select a choice activity, such as bring a show and tell item. Or in this case, what does it say? It says sit down at the teacher's desk for a while. Another system might be daily recognition forms, where teachers award each student a starting score at the beginning of class, for example, 20 points, for a prearranged set of expectations. And then if a student fails to meet a particular expectation, the teacher can take away some or all the points associated with that expectation. So we have daily recognition forms. These are extrinsic systems that work with students who have not yet developed intrinsic motivation or are in the process of doing so, making it very tangible that we notice and appreciate them being on task and helping other students to learn. Other strategies include color-coded behavior, such as this. Teacher gives each student either a red card, yellow card, or green card based on adherence to rules and procedures. All students are going to start the day or the class period off with a green card on top. If the student's behavior warrants it, the teacher might change that card to indicate another color depending on the behavior the student's exhibiting. We can also consider certificates such as these. This is when the teacher uses reward certificates to increase parental involvement and awareness of what's going on at school. If a student helps another student with work, for example, he or she could receive a certificate as a special recognition of his or her helpfulness. One of the most powerful ones is phone calls, emails, and notes to a student's parent or guardian to recognize positive behavior. So think about being a student who gets phone calls and contacts home, but only when he or she is in trouble. Imagine early on in the semester, the term, or the school year, making contact home and asking, "Is this Johnny's home?" And whoever's on the other side asking gruffly, "Why, is he in trouble at school again?" And then instead saying, "I really appreciate having Johnny in class because of this and this." Two sincere things that you've noticed and appreciate. You're making a deposit early on, doing that often to where you can build a relationship with the parents, with the student, and then when you need to, when it's a more difficult conversation at another time, you've made deposits, and that makes it a little bit easier to make a withdrawal or to have a more difficult conversation. The final element that's foundational to effective classroom management is this: acknowledging the lack of adherence to rules and procedures. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, and maybe the efforts of students, they are not adhering to rules and procedures. They're off task and or disruptive. So when this is the case, we have strategies that we can employ. One strategy is just a verbal cue. That's when you or I as the teacher say the student's name, quietly remind the student that he or she is not in compliance with the rule or procedure, quietly state the expected appropriate behavior, or simply tell the student to stop the behavior. For example, "Susan, can we please stop poking other students with our pencil?" "Susan, we're not keeping our hands to ourselves right now. Could we please try that again?" So notice we're starting with the student's name. We're doing it quietly in a way that still respects the dignity of the student, but making it clear that the current behavior is not desirable. Also clarifying what the appropriate behavior is. So all of these statements are designed to help us know what to say in a variety of situations. Another strategy is this. It's what we call the pregnant pause. This is when the teacher stops teaching in response to reoccurring disruptive behavior. That creates what we call an uncomfortable silence that will direct attention to the room towards the misbehaving student. So let's say someone is being disruptive. I just stop instruction, pause, and eventually the students start to turn their attention to me and to the student or groups of students that are being disruptive. Now this works through this. By noticing a student behaving inappropriately, stop teaching and looked at the student, waiting for the misbehaving student to notice the pregnant pause, and then just assess the student's reaction. If the student responds to the attention by ceasing the appropriate behavior, then go ahead and continue teaching. But if the student is encouraged by the attention and continues misbehaving, you do need to use another more direct strategy, such as a verbal cue, to let the student know that the behavior needs to stop. That is the pregnant or uncomfortable, awkward pause. Okay? Nonverbal cues. These are when the teacher uses eye contact, proximity, subtle gestures such as shaking your head no, putting your fingers to your lips, a look of disapproval, or moving closer to a student to signal to the student that his or her behavior is inappropriate. Nonverbal cues can be very, very powerful. In addition, we might consider strategies such as timeout, where we ask a student who's not in compliance to go to a designated place inside or outside the classroom until the student is ready to resume their regular classroom activities. Now, we might consider, though, a kind of a graduated 3-step process. Start with a warning, reminder of the expectation, perhaps a timeout inside the classroom, and then only when needed, we do a timeout outside the classroom. We want the kids to be inside the classroom as much as possible where he or she can continue to attend and academic activities. Once we send a kid out of the classroom, they're no longer able to do so. So consider a graduated approach when using a timeout strategy. There's also overcorrection. This is when we require a student who's behaved destructively, for example, to make things better than they were before the student had the altercation. For example, let's say a student ruins class property. We would ask the student to repair what was destroyed and then improve additional class property. Finally, we have interdependent group contingencies. This is when the entire class is given a positive consequence only if every student in the class meets a certain behavioral standard. So the teacher can use this type of group contingency to reinforce positive group behaviors and in an effort to help extinguish negative group behaviors. So here we have, for the first one, timeout. We've got a little space inside the classroom. For overcorrection, a list of different behaviors that would need to be overcorrected. For example, using rude language towards a classmate, working to compose or write a sincere apology letter to the classmates. And over here, a group contingency jar as an example, where the class works together to get the class reward, the first one, the second one, and the third one. There are also home contingencies as strategies. This is to help an individual student understand that his or her teacher and the parents and guardians are unified, that they're on the same page and are working together to help the student control his or her classroom behavior. And that's when the teacher meets with the student and parents or guardians to identify and discuss the student's use of inappropriate behavior in class. It can also be a communication method, such as a home contingency log, where the teacher and student at school are filling out how things are going and relaying this information to the parent or guardian at home. So there's this back and forth communication to help everybody understand that we're in a unified attempt to help that student. Okay? Another important consideration is for each and every one of us to develop what we call a high-intensity situation plan. Think of volatile situations. We need to have a plan for these types of situations, and it could include assessing the severity of the situation, making sure we're remaining calm, actively listening, removing the student from the situation once he or she has regained some control. So for example, start with the first part. Know your student's tendencies. In many cases, especially in instances of aggressive behavior, we can tell what are the predictors. So we want to plan for positive interactions on a systematic basis and try and reduce the possibility or frequency of future incidents. So knowing our students' tendencies. We also want to recognize when a student is out of control. So whenever possible, we should know our students well enough to know when are they reaching that breaking point. Some students, they might manifest in yelling or wild gestures. Others get very, very quiet and withdrawn before they have a meltdown or an explosion. So we need to know and be able to recognize when our student's out of control. As often as possible, put physical distance between you and the student. Avoid any threatening behavior. So let's say a student's really agitated and might act out physically. Give the student enough physical space that he or she doesn't feel threatened or provoked. We want to speak directly to our student in a calm and respectful tone. Look directly at the student without staring and keeping our expression as neutral as possible. Now, other times we need to try and put distance between the student and other students in the class, especially if the student is lashing out at a peer. So if one of our kiddos is lashing out at another kiddo, we might consider placing ourselves between the aggressive student and the rest of the class, and or by asking the class to move to a specific location, such as one corner of the classroom. Other steps include making sure that we are calm. So when a student lashes out or acts aggressively, it's really natural to feel as if it's a personal attack. But to counteract these feelings, we need to allow ourselves to interact in a calm and positive way. We need to repeat positive affirmations to ourselves, like, this is not a personal attack on me. The student must just be experiencing a great deal of pain or hurt in order to act this way. So we need to calm ourselves. Then we need to listen attentively to the student without agreeing or disagreeing with what he or she is saying. Use active listening skills, make eye contact, paraphrasing. Let the student know that he or she is being heard. We want to keep our posture, our expressions, our gestures, the tone of our voice very neutral, especially as we're focusing on what the student is saying. And when the student finishes speaking, when they start to run out of gas, you affirm the student and ask, so what else is bothering you? And you repeat this process until the student doesn't have anything else to say. At this point, the student will also be calmer due to that feeling of being heard and feeling like they are better understood. Last, we can consider removing the student from the situation. Once the student is calmer, we can use a simpler, repeated request designed to remove the student from the situation. For example, Billy, I'd like you to go with me now to the hallway to get things back to normal. Will you please do that with me? So you repeat your request calmly but persistently until the student complies. Again, we're making sure that we repeat it calmly but persistently until our students do comply. So overall, we need to have this sort of plan where we're working to develop relationships with our students, exhibiting with-itness, articulating positive and negative consequences for behavior, and creating guidelines for dealing with high-intensity situations. Overall, that creates what we call an overall disciplinary plan, or an overall plan for dealing with disciplinary situations.